Ron Howard has always been the calm in the middle of Hollywood's storm, the man who built his career on grace, control, and genuine kindness. But when the conversation turns to the twisted secrets behind the industry that raised him, everything about his face changes. His usual calm fades, replaced by something cold and haunted. He once said softly, "You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the cameras stopped." And just like that, the truth hits. The so-called golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was a place powered by silence, manipulation, and cruelty. A world where fame could erase guilt and power made the rules. Those same beloved stars who once shaped America's dreams were often the same people tearing lives apart when no one was watching. And now, decades later, Ron Howard is done pretending. He's ready to name names, starting with Errol Flynn, the man insiders once called the devil behind the smile. Before there was James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, Hollywood's first true bad boy. He was the fearless pirate, the daring adventurer, the man who oozed danger and charisma on screen. But off camera, he was something far more disturbing. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn landed in Hollywood in the 1930s and skyrocketed to fame after Captain Blood, 1935. The studios molded him into a legend, charming, bold, irresistible. But behind that silver screen glow was a man driven by arrogance, addiction, and chaos. By 1942, Flynn's reputation had curdled into poison. Two young women, Peggy Satterley and Betty Hansen, accused him of statutory rape, and the world stopped to watch. Every newspaper splashed his face across front pages. America split in half. Some worshipped him. Others saw a predator hiding in plain sight. In court, Flynn laughed, joked, and acted like the charges were beneath him. He thought his fame made him bulletproof. Warner Brothers poured money into his defense. Top lawyers were brought in. Fans camped outside. And, behind the scenes, studio bosses paid witnesses to disappear. In the end, Flynn walked free. But his arrogance only grew. Years later, private letters uncovered in 1978 revealed Flynn bragging about his conquests, mocking women who were terrified of him. When Ron Howard read about that case, he said it changed him forever. "That's when I realized Hollywood could protect monsters, as long as they smiled for the camera," he admitted. To the public, Flynn stayed a lovable rogue. To insiders, he became the ultimate cautionary tale. His final years were a slow-motion collapse. Alcohol, drugs, and debt devoured him. By 1959, at just 50 years old, his body gave out in Vancouver. The autopsy blamed heart failure and cirrhosis, but to Ron Howard, the truth was simpler. He died the same way he lived, taking everything and giving nothing. Flynn's story became a warning. Proof that charm can mask cruelty, and that fame, no matter how blinding, can't wash away what's real. It was the first crack in the illusion of old Hollywood, a reminder that behind every perfect smile, there's a shadow waiting to be seen. And then came another, Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Douglas represented the ultimate contradiction. A hero on screen, a storm off it. Born Izer Danielovich in 1916 to struggling immigrant parents, he clawed his way from poverty to power with sheer determination. By the time Spartacus made him a global superstar, he had everything: wealth, fame, and endless respect. But for those who worked under him, there was another story. One of control, fear, and a temper that could light up a room for all the wrong reasons. Douglas played men of justice and courage, but when the cameras stopped rolling, that same fire often turned destructive. He fought everyone, directors, co-stars, even producers who dared question him. His rage was legendary, his charm unshakable, and his contradictions unforgettable. Crew members who worked with Kirk Douglas said he was impossible to satisfy. One wrong move, and he'd explode in a burst of fury that left people shaken to their core. Actress Deborah Paget once confessed, "He didn't just want to dominate a scene. He wanted to dominate everyone in it. That says it all. Ron Howard, who grew up studying Douglas's performances, later admitted there was something haunting behind that famous smile, a kind of rage that eats a person alive. And that rage never left him. It shadowed Douglas through his entire career, staining every story whispered behind Hollywood's golden curtains. For decades, rumors about his behavior toward women have refused to die. Biographers and insiders still point to one of the darkest allegations: his alleged involvement in the 1950s assault of young actress Natalie Wood, who was only 16 at the time. The claim didn't come to light until after Wood's tragic death and was later repeated by her sister Lana in her 2018 memoir. Douglas was never charged, and like so many others of his generation, his name was shielded by the same powerful silence that kept Hollywood's darkest truths hidden. Even when he passed in 2020 at the age of 103, the controversy didn't fade. It resurfaced, louder than ever, echoing through sets and studios as a long overdue reckoning. Those who worked with him described his presence as both magnetic and terrifying, a man who could inspire one moment and destroy the next. Stanley Kubrick, who directed Douglas twice, once said he was the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control. That says everything. To Ron Howard, the real lesson from Douglas's story wasn't about stardom or legacy. It was about power. Howard reflected that Douglas lived by his own code, convinced that rules didn't apply to him, and Hollywood went right along with it. When Douglas accepted his honorary Oscar in 1996, most viewers saw an old legend seeking redemption. But Howard saw something much darker, the final act of a man still trying to outrun his own demons. Behind the cheers and applause, one truth lingered. Hollywood's brightest legends sometimes built their fame not on greatness, but on fear. And just when it seemed that story couldn't get any colder, there was Faye Dunaway, the so-called Queen of Cruelty. If Errol Flynn embodied corruption and Kirk Douglas symbolized uncontrollable rage, then Dunaway took it to a whole other level. Cruelty dressed in elegance. To Ron Howard, she was living proof that evil in Hollywood didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from control, humiliation, and an ego so towering it crushed everything in its path. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway rose through the ranks like a comet. From Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, to Chinatown, 1974, she became untouchable, the ultimate screen goddess, icy, magnetic, flawless. But behind the camera, the whispers were relentless. Crew members told stories of tantrums so fierce that grown men walked off set in tears. Assistants came and went like disposable props, replaced after every meltdown. Her mommy dearest co-star Rutanya Alda once said, "You could feel the fear on set. Everyone was waiting for her to explode." And she meant it. The movie was supposed to be about abuse and control, but it ended up mirroring Dunaway's own behavior. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman infamous for her cruelty, Dunaway allegedly copied her every move, barking orders, hurling insults, and demanding perfection at any cost. Director Frank Perry even admitted later that he almost quit because he couldn't handle her rage. She threw objects, screamed at makeup artists, and once refused to shoot a single frame until the lighting made her look divine. It was chaos wrapped in glamour. Years later, Ron Howard pointed to her as the perfect example of how an actor's hunger for control can twist into something darker, what he called emotional terrorism. And the storm didn't stop there. On The Wicked Lady, Dunaway allegedly slapped a cameraman mid-shoot, and during Don Juan DeMarco, she was accused of spitting on a crew member. Behind that dazzling smile was a temper that could burn down a room. Hollywood adored her brilliance, but feared her power. Faye Dunaway's reputation for cruelty didn't just live in whispers, it stopped productions cold. Crew members said she'd humiliate assistants until they were in tears, sometimes forcing the entire shoot to shut down for a full day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, once put it bluntly, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." And by the 2000s, that diva image had caught up with her. Hollywood stopped calling. Directors flat out refused to work with her, calling her unmanageable. In 2011, after being fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, Dunaway lashed out, blaming everyone but herself. When a journalist later asked Ron Howard about her legacy, his answer was calm but sharp as glass. She chased perfection so hard she forgot compassion. Her downfall wasn't sudden. It was a long, painful unraveling. The woman who once ruled Hollywood with icy confidence ended up isolated, avoided even at retrospectives celebrating her own films. To Ron Howard, her story was the ultimate warning, proof that talent without empathy is a ticking time bomb. "People talk about power," he once said, "but in Hollywood, power without grace turns to poison." And then came the Duke, John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few names loomed larger over Hollywood's history. To millions, he was the face of America itself, the brave cowboy, the fearless soldier, the no-nonsense man's man. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching him in black and white, the truth behind that rugged image was much darker. "When I learned who he really was," Howard once admitted, "I stopped seeing a hero. I saw a bully wearing his country like a costume." Born Marion Morrison in 1907 in Iowa, Wayne built his fame by selling an illusion, unshakable masculinity. By the 1950s, he wasn't just an actor, he was an ideology. To him, progress was betrayal, and compassion looked like weakness. On his film sets, he ruled by fear. Crew members remembered the tension. Technicians cursed out in front of everyone, actors terrified to miss a cue. Fellow actor Christopher Mitchum once recalled, "When Duke was angry, the air froze. You either agreed with him or you were gone." Ron Howard later summed it up perfectly. "That kind of control isn't art. It's fear, pretending to be discipline." But Wayne's cruelty didn't stop when the cameras cut. He was infamous for mocking women on set, belittling indigenous actors in westerns, and dismissing black performers who dared to challenge stereotypes. And then came his 1971 Playboy interview, a moment that ripped away any illusion of innocence. In that now infamous conversation, Wayne claimed that Native Americans were selfishly keeping land, said black people weren't ready for self-governance, and declared that movies needed real men, not whiners. Decades later, those quotes resurfaced, and the outrage was instant. The cowboy icon had revealed himself not as a patriot, but as a man trapped in bitterness and hate. On the set of The Searchers, his darkest performance, Wayne clashed fiercely with director John Ford. Ford wanted Ethan Edwards, a racist Confederate soldier, portrayed as complex and broken. Wayne refused, insisting on making the man heroic. In the final cut, the character's cruelty bled through anyway, and Howard later said that's what made it haunting. "It's terrifying," he said. "You can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even when cancer weakened him in his final years, Wayne never apologized. He dismissed critics as soft, blamed the changing world for his fading relevance, and clung to the myth he'd built. He died in 1979 at 72, still worshipped by many. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story stood as a cautionary tale. Power built on hate doesn't age into wisdom. It rots into bitterness. "The myth survived," Howard once said, "but the man behind it never deserved the legend." And then there was Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Ron Howard, that name symbolized the truth Hollywood never wanted to face, that genius and evil can live inside the same man. "I admired his films," Howard once admitted, "before I knew who he really was. Then I realized, talent doesn't excuse a person. Sometimes it hides them." Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents, Polanski survived the horrors of Nazi occupation, a past that seemed to shape the darkness of his art. His early films, Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, made critics call him a visionary, a director who turned paranoia into poetry. But the shadows in his movies weren't fiction. They were reflections of himself. Then came March 1977, and the illusion shattered forever. Polanski was arrested for the assault of 13-year-old Samantha Gailey after a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's home. The evidence was undeniable. He pled guilty to unlawful sex with a minor, then fled the country before sentencing, escaping to France and never returning. Hollywood split in two, half condemned him, half defended him as a misunderstood artist. For young Ron Howard, the reaction was sickening. "They talked about art," he later said, "while a child's life was broken." To him, that moment marked one of Hollywood's deepest moral failures. Even as Polanski remained in exile, his fame somehow lived on. In 2003, decades after his crime, he won an Oscar for The Pianist. The audience at the Dolby Theater stood in applause, a moment Howard described as both surreal and revolting. "I didn't stand," he admitted. "I thought of that girl, 13, alone, and wondered how applause must sound to her ears." Howard's disgust wasn't just moral, it was personal. To him, Hollywood's willingness to separate genius from guilt was the industry's greatest betrayal. Talent should never be a shield for cruelty. Yet again and again, it was. And in that truth, in those moments of silence and complicity, Ron Howard saw what Hollywood really feared most. Not scandal, but accountability. When Roman Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, the ceremony erupted. Protesters stormed out in fury, shouting that the industry had crossed a line that should have never been blurred. To Ron Howard, that moment finally looked like justice. Late, but not too late. "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day," he told Vanity Fair in 2021. "A monster doesn't become less monstrous just because he can frame a shot." That line hit like a thunderclap. Polanski remains free in Europe, protected, celebrated in some circles, but forever haunted by his own name. To most, he's now the definition of hypocrisy. For Ron Howard, his story summed up everything that poisoned Hollywood's so-called golden age, a system that shielded the artist but abandoned the victim. "Hollywood forgives anything," Howard once said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." And just when you think it couldn't get darker, there's Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Roman Polanski stood for Hollywood's hypocrisy, Rooney embodied its illusion. The idea that charm and laughter could erase cruelty and pain. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's happy-go-lucky musicals on late-night TV, learning the truth was like watching innocence crumble in real time. "He was the face of joy," Howard said once. But behind that smile was misery. And worse, he spread it. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Mickey Rooney was Hollywood's first true child superstar. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America, a living dream. MGM built an empire around his boyish grin, selling audiences the fantasy of the all-American kid who sang, danced, and always got the girl. But fame that big, that young, twists people fast. Rooney's life became a storm of chaos. He married 8 times, cheated endlessly, gambled away millions, and publicly humiliated those closest to him. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once snapped, "He's the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world," and she wasn't exaggerating. Behind the scenes, the darkness only grew. In 2011, headlines exposed that his 8th wife, John Chamberlain, and his stepson were accused of elder abuse and financial manipulation, draining his accounts and cutting him off from family. But long before that, the damage Rooney caused to others had already become legend. Former co-stars remembered him as volatile, unpredictable, and cruel. Even Judy Garland, his closest friend during their MGM years, once said privately that Rooney could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next. That's chilling. Garland, already being crushed under the studio's pressure, later hinted that Rooney shared part of the blame for her suffering, not just the executives. Her pain wasn't only manufactured by the system, it was personal, and he was part of it. By the 1960s, Mickey Rooney's golden glow had completely faded. His career imploded under the weight of addiction, gambling debts, and scandal. Every comeback ended in disaster. In a 1979 interview, he tried to make peace with his past, saying, "I've lived 1,000 lives." But Ron Howard later summed it up perfectly. Yeah, but he lived them all for himself. Even old age didn't humble him. Rooney's bitterness only deepened. He blamed everyone, the studios, his wives, even God, for his downfall. By the time he passed in 2014, at the age of 93, all the glitter was gone. His estate was worth less than $20,000. His body went unclaimed for a time until friends gathered money for a modest burial in Los Angeles. For Ron Howard, Rooney's story wasn't just tragic. It was symbolic. The final piece in a long, twisted puzzle that exposed the real heart of old Hollywood. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said softly. And maybe that's the saddest evil of all, when pain turns into performance and no one notices. To Howard, these stories were never about revenge or cheap gossip. They were about truth, the truth that power, talent, and fame often come at a price that no one dares to talk about. The kind of truth that strips away the golden glow and shows what was always there underneath: desperation, control, and decay. Every name, every scandal, every untouchable legend proved the same thing to him. Hollywood's greatest illusion wasn't the movies. It was the belief that brilliance and kindness could live in the same man without a cost. If Mickey Rooney's smile was a mask, then Marlon Brando's soul was a battlefield. To Ron Howard, Brando represented the most dangerous kind of Hollywood legend. A man so brilliant that people mistook his pain for depth and his cruelty for genius. "He changed acting forever," Howard once said. But behind all that brilliance, he was chaos pretending to be art. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1924, Brando grew up in a storm of neglect and resentment. His parents were wealthy, but broken, a father who mocked him, a mother lost in alcohol. By the time he hit New York's acting scene in the 1940s, he'd already turned his trauma into a weapon. The method wasn't just his technique, it was his shield. When A Streetcar Named Desire hit Broadway, the world fell at his feet. He was raw, magnetic, unpredictable, the kind of performer that made the audience hold their breath. But that same fire that made him brilliant burned everything around him. On set, he terrorized directors, ignored scripts, and broke co-stars emotionally just to find the truth in a scene. Ron Howard once said Brando taught him two lessons: how to feel real emotion and how power can twist it. Brando didn't just play dominance, he lived it. His performances in On the Waterfront and The Wild One made him a cultural god, but off camera, he turned that same defiance into a weapon against anyone who dared question him. By the time he starred in The Godfather, 1972, Brando had turned his rebellion into mythology. He demanded studio control, rewrote scenes on the fly, and once refused to memorize lines altogether. Instead, he hid cue cards around the set. It became part of the legend. The genius who doesn't need a script. But Howard always said there was nothing romantic about it. He didn't respect his craft anymore, Howard told Vanity Fair. He was daring everyone to call him out, and no one did. That arrogance bled into his personal life, too. Brando was infamous for his affairs. Women, men, co-stars, assistants. It didn't matter. He used people like mirrors, taking what he needed emotionally and vanishing the moment they got too close. He fathered 11 children with 3 women, but many of them grew up barely knowing him. His son Christian later said in an interview, "He could love you like the sun one day and forget you existed the next." Howard once reflected that Brando's cruelty came from the same place as his genius. Pain turned inward until it spilled out on everyone else. He felt too much, Howard said, but instead of healing, he made everyone else feel it for him. Then came Last Tango in Paris, 1972, the film that changed everything, and not for the better. Decades later, actress Maria Schneider revealed that one of the film's most disturbing scenes had been shot without her full consent. The director, Bernardo Bertolucci, and Brando had planned it privately, keeping her in the dark to get a real reaction. That reaction became one of the most infamous betrayals in Hollywood history. Ron Howard called that revelation the moment the mask slipped. He told The Guardian, "That wasn't art. That was power pretending to be creativity." The incident left Schneider emotionally shattered and became a lasting scar on Brando's legacy. "People excused it because it was Brando," Howard said. "But if you have to hurt someone to make your art, it's not art. It's cruelty." In the years that followed, Brando retreated into bitterness. He mocked Hollywood, despised interviews, and called the industry a cesspool run by liars. Yet he never fully walked away. When the money ran low, he'd reappear, heavier, angrier, more detached, demanding millions for roles he barely cared about. During Superman, 1978, he refused to learn his lines, insisting his character could be played as a floating light. He filmed for 10 days and walked away with nearly $4 million. Ron Howard once joked that Brando had become his own experiment, a man proving that fame without humility eats itself alive. "He didn't just lose interest," Howard said. "He lost his soul on camera, one role at a time." Behind the scenes, Brando's private life became a tragedy that no script could soften. His son, Christian, was convicted of manslaughter in 1990 after shooting his sister's boyfriend. His daughter, Cheyenne, took her own life 5 years later. When reporters asked Brando about it, he blamed the media, Hollywood, even fate, everyone but himself. He couldn't face his own reflection anymore, Howard said. The man who spent his life pretending to be everyone else couldn't stand to be himself. By the time Brando died in 2004, he was a recluse, alone, paranoid, and surrounded by ghosts of the people he'd hurt. His name still drew awe, but to Howard, it drew something else: sorrow. "Brando was the blueprint for the tortured genius," he said. "But what people forget is that torture doesn't stay poetic, it becomes toxic." And when the credits finally rolled on his life, the legend felt hollow. All the applause, all the Oscars, all the mystique, it couldn't hide the truth that Brando, the man who once reinvented acting, had also exposed its darkest cost. For Ron Howard, Brando's story wasn't about destruction, it was about warning. "He taught us what happens when emotion has no boundaries," Howard once told Esquire. "When pain becomes performance and everyone claps for it, even as it breaks someone apart." That, to Howard, was the real tragedy of old Hollywood. Brilliance built on suffering, wrapped in glamour, and sold as genius. Every star who came after walked in that same shadow, proof that the same flame that lights up the screen can burn everything around it to ash. If Marlon Brando was chaos dressed as genius, then Frank Sinatra was charm sharpened into a weapon. To Ron Howard, Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was Hollywood's original power broker, the man who proved that charisma could be more dangerous than violence. "He didn't just own the room," Howard once said. "He made the room afraid to breathe wrong." Born in Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1915, Sinatra climbed out of working-class roots with a microphone in his hand and a temper that could cut glass. By the 1940s, he was the sound of America, smooth, confident, untouchable. Crowds fainted at his concerts, women screamed his name, and every man wanted to stand where he stood. But behind that velvet voice was a temper so explosive that even his closest friends feared him. Ron Howard once described him as the first celebrity who turned charm into control. Sinatra didn't just demand loyalty, he owned people with it. If you were in his circle, you lived under his rules. If you crossed him, you were done. Crew members, waiters, even journalists learned that the hard way. A smile from Sinatra could make your career, but a glare could end it overnight. By the 1950s, his image had been reborn, from the boyish crooner to the slick, dangerous man in the sharp suit. From Here to Eternity earned him an Oscar and the respect he'd been craving. But it also gave him something else: power. He became the center of the Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, a group that ruled Hollywood nights and Las Vegas days. But Howard said there was always a shadow behind the laughter. Sinatra wasn't just drinking and singing, he was negotiating. He played cards with mobsters, argued politics with presidents, and used his influence to pull favors that blurred every moral line in town. FBI files later revealed his deep ties to organized crime, connections he always denied, but never escaped. He wanted to be loved like a king, Howard once said, but he ruled like a boss who thought every favor came with interest. Stories from his sets and shows became legend. He'd fire musicians mid-performance if they missed a note, and one wrong look from a cameraman could trigger a tirade that left grown men shaking. When a Life magazine photographer once refused to hand over a roll of film, Sinatra allegedly cornered him and smashed his camera, then offered to buy his silence with a smile. Howard remembered reading those stories as a young director and realizing that Sinatra's aura wasn't built on talent alone. It was built on fear. He didn't inspire respect, Howard said. He demanded obedience. But it wasn't just men who bore the brunt of his rage. His relationships were just as stormy, a string of passionate, destructive romances that played out like tabloid warfare. His marriage to Ava Gardner was a headline-making inferno. They fought so viciously that hotel rooms were left in ruins. Gardner once admitted, "We loved hard and hated harder." When their marriage imploded, Sinatra spiraled. He threatened to quit music altogether, even attempted to take his own life. But Hollywood doesn't let its icons fade quietly. His comeback single, "I've Got You Under My Skin," turned his pain into gold and reminded everyone that he could make heartbreak sound like seduction. Howard called that his most dangerous talent. He said, Sinatra could turn pain into performance, but instead of healing, it made people worship his damage. And that damage showed in every part of his life. He was fiercely loyal to friends until they crossed him. Peter Lawford learned that the hard way after a fallout over President Kennedy's visit. Sinatra had built a private helipad on his Palm Springs estate for JFK's arrival, but when Kennedy canceled last minute, Sinatra took an axe to the runway, smashing tiles and screaming Lawford's name. The friendship was dead, and so was Lawford's career, at least in Sinatra's world. By the 1970s, the crooner who once symbolized class had become a man out of time. The world was changing, the youth, the culture, the sound, but Sinatra stayed frozen in his empire of control. He mocked rock music, despised feminism, and dismissed the civil rights movement as noise. Yet, he performed benefit shows with Sammy Davis Jr., confusing fans who never knew which side of history he truly stood on. Ron Howard once said, "That's what power does. It lets you rewrite your story every day, and everyone just nods along." Behind the tuxedos and spotlight, Sinatra's life was a constant contradiction, generosity mixed with cruelty, brilliance stained by arrogance. He gave millions to charity, but destroyed reputations with a single phone call. He sang about love, then weaponized it in his private life. He wanted the world to adore him, Howard said, but he couldn't stand anyone who didn't. Even in his later years, that iron grip never softened. When a journalist once asked him if he regretted his temper, Sinatra smirked and said, "Hell no. It got me here, didn't it?" To Ron Howard, that quote said everything. He didn't see his flaws as flaws, Howard reflected. He saw them as proof that he mattered more than anyone else. When Sinatra died in 1998 at 82, Hollywood mourned him like a king. But Howard couldn't help but notice what no one said, that the man everyone called the voice had spent a lifetime silencing others. In the end, Sinatra's story fit perfectly into Howard's growing understanding of old Hollywood, that behind every golden spotlight was a darker truth. They called him the chairman of the board, Howard once said, but the boardroom was built on fear. Sinatra's smile could melt a room, his music could break your heart. But his legacy, that blend of beauty and brutality, proved something deeper to Howard. That power without empathy doesn't make legends, it makes tyrants who sing. If Frank Sinatra ruled Hollywood with fear, Elizabeth Taylor conquered it with desire. To Ron Howard, she wasn't just a star. She was the storm every man thought he could tame and every woman wanted to survive. She didn't just play dangerous women, Howard once said. She was one, beautiful, brilliant, and built from chaos. Born in London in 1932 and raised in Los Angeles, Taylor's rise to fame was almost too perfect. MGM discovered her at 9, and by 12, National Velvet had made her America's sweetheart. But behind those violet eyes was a girl growing up in the machine, molded, controlled, and told her beauty was her destiny. They raised her like a product, Howard said. By the time she realized she had power, she was already addicted to using it. By her 20s, Elizabeth Taylor had become more than an actress. She was a headline. Every movie she made, every love she found, and every tragedy she endured was broadcast to the world. She turned heartbreak into an empire, Howard said. Hollywood taught her that pain sells, and she sold it better than anyone. Her marriages became part of the myth. 8 weddings, 7 husbands, and a lifetime of chaos that followed her like perfume. From Conrad Hilton Jr. to Richard Burton, twice, every relationship burned hotter than the last. She loved like it was war, Howard said, and every time she lost, she came back stronger. Her affair with Burton on the set of Cleopatra, 1963, shocked the world. 2 married stars, trapped in a scandal so massive it nearly destroyed the studio. Vatican newspapers condemned her. The press called her a homewrecker, and audiences couldn't look away. Yet, when Cleopatra hit theaters, she turned that scandal into gold, becoming the first actor in history to earn $1 million for a single role. She didn't escape the fire, Howard said. She built her throne in the middle of it. But that power came with a cost. On set, Taylor's perfectionism clashed with everyone. Directors, co-stars, even producers who were terrified to cross her. Crew members described her as impossible one moment, angelic the next. She'd arrive late, demand full rewrites, and vanish mid-shoot if something wasn't right. Yet when the cameras rolled, she was electric. She could cry on command, Howard said. But the tears always felt real, maybe because they were. Her relationship with Burton was both her greatest passion and her deepest curse. They fought like thunder, jealousy, alcohol, and fame tearing them apart night after night. "We loved each other too much," Burton once said, "and it nearly killed us." Their fights were legendary, broken bottles, screaming matches, and reconciliations so fiery the tabloids couldn't keep up. To Ron Howard, that love story wasn't romance. It was addiction disguised as devotion. "They were poison and antidote all at once," he said. "2 people too big for the same life." But beneath the diamonds and drama, Elizabeth Taylor carried real pain. She battled chronic illness, addiction to painkillers, and the crushing weight of fame that never left her alone. Even her friends admitted she could be manipulative, but she was also fiercely loyal. "She'd curse you out and then pay your hospital bills," one co-star once said. That was Elizabeth, fury and kindness in one body. By the late 1970s, the scandals had quieted, but the legend hadn't. Taylor began using her fame for something Hollywood had never expected: advocacy. When the AIDS crisis hit in the 1980s, she became one of the first celebrities to fight for awareness and compassion. At a time when studios avoided the topic, she raised millions, founded AmFAR, and stood beside victims the world tried to ignore. Ron Howard said that moment changed how he saw her completely. After years of playing goddesses and villains, she finally played herself, a human being, he told Vanity Fair. She was proof that redemption doesn't erase your sins, it balances them. Still, her softer side didn't erase the damage. The years of indulgence left scars. health problems, addiction relapses, and loneliness that fame couldn't cure. Yet, she never lost her bite. When reporters asked about her marriages, she famously quipped, "I still believe in love, just not the same man twice." Howard often pointed to her as the symbol of Hollywood's most dangerous promise, that beauty and power could protect you from pain. She had everything, he said. Money, fame, love, and still, it was never enough. That's the curse of the spotlight. It gives, then it takes. In her final years, Taylor withdrew from public life but stayed fiercely protective of her legacy. She refused to apologize for her past, her temper, or her excesses. "I lived big," she once said. "Small lives don't interest me." When she passed in 2011, the world mourned a queen, the last goddess of the Golden Age. But to Ron Howard, her story was both inspiring and haunting. "Elizabeth Taylor was the price of beauty," he said. "She proved that glamour can be armor, but even armor cracks." For Howard, she completed the pattern, another legend shaped by the same forces that had destroyed so many before her. "They called it the Golden Age," he once told Esquire, "but for every light that shined, there were 10 burning behind it." Taylor's story, like the others, wasn't about tragedy alone. It was about survival, the art of staying magnificent while the world tried to own you. "She didn't hide from her chaos," Howard said. "She wore it like a crown." And that was the truth of old Hollywood in its purest form. Not the red carpets or the fairy tales, but the fire that forged its icons. Behind the beauty, behind the fame, behind the diamonds, there was always damage, and it glittered just as bright. As the years passed and Ron Howard grew from a child actor into one of Hollywood's most respected directors, his fascination with the industry's shine never faded. But neither did his disgust at its shadows. He'd seen enough to know the truth. Every legend carried a secret. Every masterpiece hid a bruise. "They called it glamour," Howard once said, "but it was just pain wearing makeup." By the time he was winning Oscars of his own, Howard's relationship with the industry had changed completely. He wasn't just making movies, he was quietly rewriting their history. To him, the so-called Golden Age wasn't a period of greatness. It was a breeding ground for everything toxic that Hollywood still tries to hide. "People think time changes the game," he said, "but power doesn't evolve. It just learns new tricks." He watched as the same cycle repeated with new faces and fresher scandals. The same system that once protected Errol Flynn and Roman Polanski now did the same for modern stars. The same excuses, the same silences. "We never learned," Howard said bitterly. "We just learned how to lie prettier." When he spoke about it publicly, Howard didn't sound angry. He sounded tired. "I love film," he told Variety. "But sometimes I wonder if film ever loved anyone back." He'd seen too many stories like Flynn's arrogance, Douglas's fury, Dunaway's cruelty, Brando's chaos, Sinatra's power, and Taylor's torment to believe in fairy tales anymore. "You can build a dream factory," he said, "but dreams built on suffering always collapse." Still, he didn't believe in hopelessness. If anything, his goal became to tell the truth, not the gossip, not the glamorized myth, but the truth that the audience never gets to see. "Hollywood sold perfection," he once said, "but perfection is a lie that eats its maker." Howard often reflected that the real courage wasn't in pretending to be flawless, it was in being honest about the flaws that built the system. He believed that the next generation of filmmakers had a choice, to keep repeating the cycle or to finally break it. "We don't need more gods on screens," he said. "We need humans who remember what it costs to make magic." When a journalist asked him what the Golden Age meant to him now, his answer was quiet, but it echoed like thunder. It was an empire of light built on shadows, beautiful, but rotten underneath. He wasn't bitter toward the legends, even the cruel ones. To him, they were products of a machine that taught them to trade empathy for applause. "They didn't know how to be people anymore," he said. They only knew how to be myths. And that, he believed, was Hollywood's oldest trick: to make monsters look like icons and to make pain look like performance. Ron Howard's voice cracked when he talked about the victims, the forgotten assistants, the silenced women, the ruined lives left behind by the stars everyone adored. They kept the machine running, he said, and when it broke them, nobody noticed, because the lights were still on. That's why, even in his most successful years, Howard stayed grounded. While others built empires, he built sets where kindness mattered. "I don't want fear on my sets," he said. "I want trust." He learned from history, from the brutality that hid behind the smiles of old Hollywood. "The past doesn't scare me," he said. "Repeating it does." He used to walk through old studio lots, the same sound stages where legends once ruled, and feel the weight of ghosts in the silence. "You can almost hear it," he said once. "The applause, the laughter, the secrets they left behind." To him, those ghosts weren't there to haunt, they were there to warn. In interviews, Howard was always careful not to moralize, but his words cut through like truth disguised as wisdom. "Every generation thinks it's different," he said, "but as long as fame means more than decency, Hollywood will always have its devils." He didn't write exposés or call for cancellations. That wasn't his style. Instead, he told stories that made people feel. Films like A Beautiful Mind and Cinderella Man, stories about broken people finding grace. "I guess that's my rebellion," he said. "To prove you can tell a powerful story without breaking someone to get it." When he was asked what he wanted his legacy to be, Howard smiled, a small, tired smile that carried decades of truth. "If I leave anything behind," he said, "I hope it's proof that you can be kind and still win." The interviewer pressed him about the legends: Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Brando, Sinatra, Polanski, Rooney, Taylor, all the names that haunted the Golden Age. Did he hate them? "No," he said softly. "I pity them." He paused, thinking. They thought fame would save them, but fame doesn't save anyone. It just shines a light on the cracks. And that's how Ron Howard summed up everything he'd learned about Hollywood: the good, the bad, and the unspeakable. "We built a world on dreams," he said, "but dreams need truth to survive." As the lights fade and the curtain drops on his final reflection, his words linger like an echo through the empty stages of Hollywood's past. Behind every smile, there was pain. Behind every legend, a lie. But behind every lie, someone brave enough to tell the truth. And for Ron Howard, that truth was the only kind of legacy worth leaving. The Golden Age was never really gold. It was smoke and mirrors, starlight and sorrow. But even in the ruins, Howard believed there was something worth saving: honesty, empathy, and the courage to make movies that heal instead of harm. As the screen fades to black, his voice, calm, weary, but unwavering, delivers the final line that ties it all together. "Hollywood isn't evil, it's just human, and that's what makes it dangerous and beautiful."